Welcome to the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and in this episode, we are going to look back at the 2022 season. We're going to look at the wide receivers, the overvalued wide receivers, specifically overperceived, overrated, however you want to word it, based on kind of how their performance ended up coming out. Consistency has a lot to do with how we're going to be looking at these players. It's my equalized value system, EV for short. And so first, I do want to just bring you through the process. And this is the only video that I'm going to talk about the process, the methodology behind how I come to the determinations of how these players ended up getting ranked for 2022. We'll go and just look at how they were ranked right after I explain the methodology. So if you are familiar with this or don't care, then you can scoot forward. There are bookmarks down below. For the first step, over the last 2 seasons now, I have gathered the values, the fantasy points scored of each player for each position that ended in that position's number 1, number 6, number 12, 18, 24, depending on the position, going all the way up to the player 72's finish, how many points they scored that week. And then I've taken all of those values and I've calculated the averages and the standard deviations, which you can actually see here. And so here are those averages, here are those standard deviations. Then the next step, just for looking at this season, I have gathered the fantasy points scored of the top 60 wide receivers per both the overall fantasy points scored across the entirety of the season and on a per week basis, average fantasy points scored. And so here is my list of all the receivers, and you can see I ended up with 68 receivers that made this list. Each position will have a different, top X amount of players that I will be looking at. Basically went with double the amount that you would need to fill on a lot of league rosters. So now that I have each value of each player, how many points they scored each and every week, I go back and then I calculate the Z-score of each of those data points. And I use a standard normal distribution in order to group them, essentially. You've heard of it as a bell curve. And I use those Z-scores to group all players that scored within the roughly 68% chance range of being the wide receiver 1, 6, 12, etc. on any given week, on each given week. For example, the wide receiver 1 on any given week, most likely, aka that 68% chance range, scored between 26.5 and 36.9 fantasy points in half PPR. So you can see that would actually be this average minus and plus this standard deviation. Those are going to be the Z-scores that land between +1 and -1 for each week. I just have this Z-score calculated, and I will actually right now it is set to this average, which I already have it organized by. So highest average up top. And so you would see if I were to unhide the number under here, it's going to be between -1 and 1. And this is just really not necessary to show here, but this is how I end up the process I developed to go through and end up color coding these. So to continue on, that is where we are at. Then I go over to the master key over here and I link the most probable result of each player's weekly score, and I award points based on those results. Over here you can see the point system on an evenly distributed point system. So it is not weighted towards the top or anything like that, and it is capped. And so right between here, you will see actually there are the results of the amount of points rewarded each time. And then I use this color coding over here for the weeks. That way you can see that score resulted in, as a wide receiver 1 here for Justin Jefferson in week 1, for instance. So then right here is the EV score, and this is just an average of all of these values over here, which I can then cross-reference back over into this list here in order to determine how they did across the season. So at the end of the day, this EV system is how I ranked how the players did last season. So we can just quick run through this. My number one wide receiver of the 2022 season was Cooper Kupp, followed by Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Stephon Diggs, A.J. Brown, Devontae Adams, CeeDee Lamb, DeAndre Hopkins, and Keenan Allen, I believe, to wrap that up as my top 10 for the 2022 season, followed by Amon-Ra St. Brown, Chris Godwin, Jalen Waddle, Deebo Samuel, Tyler Lockett, Devonta Smith, T. Higgins, Cooper Kupp. That's Terry McLaurin, Chris Olave. That should be the second 10 there. Then we have Brandon Ayuk, Mike Williams, Marquise Brown. All right, I just brought over the ranks so we can see him right here because I have him in a different spot on the chart. But DK Metcalf is the 24th ranked wide receiver, followed by Mike Evans at 25, Christian Kirk 26, Jacoby Myers, Michael Pittman, Jerry Jeudy, Alan Lazard in at wide receiver 30, followed by DJ Moore, Mecole Hardman, Gabe Davis, Curtis Samuel, Jahan Dotson, Garrett Wilson, Zay Jones, we're up to 37 here. Juju Smith-Schuster at wide receiver 38 on the season. Cortland Sutton, Brandon Cooks, Adam Thielen, Deontay Johnson, Rondale Moore, Darius Slayton, Nico Collins at wide receiver 45, followed by Tyler Boyd, DJ Shark all the way at 47, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Christian Watson down at 49. Obviously, we adjust for some of the injury games that he had. He's going to have a much higher average here when looking at towards next season. Then Isaiah Hodgins at wide receiver 50. Well, he did really good down the stretch, followed by Joshua Palmer, surprisingly down at 51. George Pickens, Drake London, Rashid Shaheed, Rashad Bateman in at wide receiver 55, followed by Matt Collins, Treylon Burks, Richie James, Russell Gage, Isaiah McKenzie, Paris Campbell, Devin Duvernay, KJ Osborne at wide receiver 63, Marvin Jones, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, Noah Brown, Chris Moore, Alec Pierce as the worst out of everybody who qualified for the receivers, and so he would have been on average a wide receiver 60, not very usable. And so in short, what is this system doing? What are we actually seeing? The EV system values consistency over boom or bust performances. Why, you ask? Because this helps to remove any bias that a monstrous week can bring into how we view a player on a player's average fantasy points scored per game number. And don't get me wrong, that number is better than using the total fantasy points scored across the season in order to rank how good players were or weren't. However, the average fantasy points per week is also flawed. And I can already hear you. And you're correct. Of course, this system, the EV system, is not perfect either, but I find it to be a better representation of the number of games a player has helped you to win or lose versus the field. And ultimately, that is what's most important. No, I do still reward and punish players for exceptional performance or exceptionally poor performances, but the reward or punishment is capped so that, for example, a 50-point performance compared to like a 60-point performance in 1 week are going to be valued exactly the same. They're both going to get the reward for being the probability of them being a wide receiver 1 being so high that there's almost no chance that they are beat, and that reward would go up to 39. At that point, the rest of your team would really have to do horribly in order for this player to not have absolutely helped you win the week. And so why should you be rewarding a player for, 1 week's performance over the next 10 weeks or something like that, as that value will increase how the player appears to have done across the season, even though maybe they just did really good 1 week. So actually, here's going to be an extreme example of what the equalized value does to more accurately represent a player's true value to the success of your fantasy squad. How much are they actually helping your team on a week-to-week basis? Here is the example. Player A scores 60 points in week 1 and 0 points for the rest of the season. Player B scores 20 points 3 times. Player C scores 3.75 points each and every week. I did 3.75 because that is exactly 60 points across the season, across 16 weeks. There are 17 weeks in a season, but remember, every player has a bye unless they are traded. In this situation, player A would receive 39 points. They would receive that bonus on this EV scale for their week 1 performance. They would also receive a total of negative 45 points for each of those 0-point weeks. They would score negative 3 points down here is what they would be rewarded for each of those 0-point weeks, which is 15 weeks. So negative 3 times 15, negative 45. That is a net of negative 6 points across 16 weeks played, which averages negative 0.375 EV per week. So that's the number that would be here. It would be 0.75 for this person, which equates to being the wide receiver 72 of each week. Or a better way to look at it would be that the value that they brought you was the same as some receiver who averages that each and every week, which means pretty unplayable, not very good value. Player B would receive 33 points on the EV scale for each of their 20-point performances, which means a 20-point performance must be a top 6 wide receiver performance. And that's for a total of 99 points over, 3 weeks, 3 times 33. And then they would also receive negative 39 points for each of their 0-point performances, negative 3 points over 13 weeks, which nets 60 points across 16 weeks played, which comes to an average of 3.75 EV per week, which equates to being the wide receiver 66 on average each week of the season. On to player C, who receives 1.5 points on the EV scale for each of their performances over 16 weeks for an equalized total value of 24 points across the season. Obviously 0 points would be negated because each week they just earned this 1.5 points there. And that would equal to being the wide receiver 69 on average throughout the entirety of the season. Given that player C almost certainly would never make it onto a fantasy roster, nor would they ever help you to win a game, it is fitting that their weekly average is worse than player B, despite winning in a head-to-head matchup 13 of these 16 weeks if they were to play against each other. Looking at player B, the player who scored 20 points 3 times across the season, given that they legitimately could have helped their fantasy team win more games than player A with 3 top 6 performances, it is fitting that they are going to be valued higher than both player A and player C because their contributions were legitimate. Then, given that player A may or may not have been played for their huge game, they almost certainly would have gotten played 1 or 3 more times across the entirety of the season in order to try and recapture that huge game maybe the week after. I'm sure they would be played in a lot of leagues. But each and every time, that owner would have ended up with a goose egg. That would end up contributing towards just absolutely tanking their fantasy team, of course. 0 points sucks. And so it is fitting that they are valued at the worst of the group because, hey, they would have gotten people excited, no doubt, and then plop. So once again, this is an absolutely extreme example of what's happening on a smaller scale on the whole here with how these players' values are being contorted just a little bit to more represent their week in and week out value. And consistency is important because it helps you to either play guys on weeks where they will help your roster and or to sit guys. Inconsistency is how you end up with 28 points on your bench and 2 points in your starting lineup. And there is one more part of this puzzle, or 2 more, probably even more than that if I were to really dig into this, but 2 more parts of this puzzle that I like about grouping these guys into being like the wide receiver 1 or the wide receiver 30, as you saw earlier, like the wide receiver 1 has a pretty large range there of outcomes. And so by grouping these guys into like groupings of players, I find that this works a little bit better for looking forward because there are so many uncertainties each and every week. So let's just get into my list here. The first thing is that just because a guy was literally the wide receiver 3 in week 14, that does not mean that they wouldn't have been the wide receiver 1 in 10 of the other weeks across the entirety of the season. I actually have an example of this, which is actually more extreme than that difference. It's going to be the wide receiver 4, and it's going to be basically every other week except for that week. They would have done better and beaten more opponents' wide receivers, finished higher. But the equalized value system here helps to account for the randomness of weekly scoring by lumping them into most similar groupings. And speaking of randomness, each play, each game, Each week, each season has multiple and even multiples of factors that impact player scoring. Does a receiver make an excellent catch or shed a tackle against the most skilled tackler in the league? Maybe a defender slips. Or maybe that defender makes an excellent play on a ball instead of slipping, a play that prevents a touchdown that would have happened in 99.92% of situations. And what about the refs? Do they call a holding call that happened on the opposite side of the field on a play, or do they not call a call? Do they miss a DPI? And maybe one that would set up a running back with a 1-yard rushing attack and it's third down, so now the team has to punt. There are so many factors on each and every play, each and every game, etc. It is truly a game of inches, and by lumping fantasy points that are most similar into groupings here, I am accounting for some of that randomness, definitely not all of it. And so here is that real world thing that happened in the first 4 weeks of 2022 that I already alluded to. And so let's just we can get that up here. So right now I have week 2 categories from highest score to lowest fantasy points scored. But if we were to do the same for week 1, which actually we can do here, you'll see that only one player had a wide receiver 1 week. Week 3, we will see that only one player had a wide receiver week. Week 4, no players finished as wide receiver 1s. Of course, there was a wide receiver 1 that week, but the expectation would have been that somebody would have outscored these players as they do most other weeks. But in week 2, we see that 4 players finished as wide receiver 1s or had wide receiver 1 quality weeks. And here are those scores. So first of all, saying that so-and-so finished as the wide receiver 1 5 times in 2022, or that so-and-so had 10 top 12 finishes instead of 10 top 12, scoring weeks like my EV system would say. They literally had 10 top 12 finishes, and using those numbers as reasons in the 2023 fantasy draft as reasons to draft a guy, 5th or 9th or 1st at their position, whatever the argument may be, they don't hold as much weight as it sounds like they should, because they're not giving you a more true picture of how that weekly finish would have looked across any other week. Technically a RB1 some week could have 8 fantasy points and not really score that many. Of course, they did finish as the RB1, and there is some value to that, which we will get to just shortly, but that's what we are doing here by taking these statistical averages and standard deviations and looking at the bell curve with which they should be expected to finish based on how they performed. So now back to week 2 here, where you can see the top 4 wide receivers scored 38.8. 36.5, 34.9, and 34.6 fantasy points. In week 4, the wide receiver 1 scored 26.3 fantasy points. We just looked at that a moment ago. That is 8.3 points less than the wide receiver 4 here, who was Jalen Waddle in week 2. And in fact, the wide receiver 4, Jalen Waddle, in week 2 would have been the wide receiver 1 in 13 of these 17 fantasy weeks in 2022. Would have finished as the wide receiver 2 in another 3 of the 17 weeks in the fantasy football season. Now, if you're doing the math, that means in every other week except for week 2, Jalen Waddle would have been the number 1 wide receiver on that week, or in a few instances, the wide receiver 2 that week with this performance. But because there were such great performances this week, he was the wide receiver 4. But should we really look at this performance any differently, or like it's a wide receiver 4 performance? I think not. It was a wide receiver 1 performance. Just so happens that there were other guys who also had huge, massive performances that week. And now there are reasons as to why some weeks there is higher scoring at a position, or there is lower scoring at a position compared to other weeks. And with that, you could have had the wide receiver 4 in week 2. You could have had Jalen Waddle going in week 2 in your lineup. And you could have faced the wide receiver 1 that week, Stephon Diggs, in which case you did get beat at that spot. In which case, me arguing the fact that, but he would have been the wide receiver 1 pretty much every other week, that doesn't really turn an L into a W if if you lost by, less than 3 or so points here because Stephon Diggs beat out Jalen Waddle as the wide receiver 1. Meaning the fact that he was the wide receiver for this week would have actually mattered. But that's the difference between probabilities and what actually happens, and we can only really use probabilities in order to look forward until what actually happens. It's the process. You have to play the numbers. Because the odds that you not only would have faced one of those top 3 receivers, and that the difference in the final score of your matchup happens to be less than the difference between Jalen Waddle and Stephon Diggs, is ultimately not incredibly high. What is most important is that you're going to have the players on your team that are going to help you to end up getting into and winning a fantasy championship, and that throughout the entirety of the season, you will have them in your starting lineup when they go off. That's what's important. Alright, so I've finished giving you my pitch. Like I said, this will be the only video that is on, so the other videos are shorter. But now it is time to look at the overvalued wide receivers from the 2022 fantasy football season. And we will be looking at the top 5 overvalued players, mostly determined by the difference between my EV and their average fantasy points scored, which here is average fantasy points scored. Then you could see, like, right up top, obviously, Justin Jefferson's going to make this list in some way or another, and we will look at each situation. So here is the first player we're going to look at. I don't have the name on the screen yet, and as you can see, this is per the average fantasy points per week scored, the wide receiver 43 on the season. However, per the EV, equalized value, this is the wide receiver 51, so quite a large difference. Any guesses on who it is? It is Joshua Palmer. If you look over at Josh Palmer, you would find out that he only had one wide receiver 1 game, and 0 games that were better than the wide receiver 6. No dark green in here. He also had 5 games that were the wide receiver 63 or worse. Think these red, browns, probably at least this lighter, almost reddish tone right there at 3.9 fantasy points. And so ultimately what I did is I compared these players head-to-head against the players who would have a lower fantasy points per week, however, have higher EV scores here. So like you can see the player right behind him. All of these players are going to be included in that list. Looking at Cortland Sutton, Deontay Johnson, Isaiah Hodgins, Brandon Cooks, Darius Slayton, DJ Shark. So how did he do head-to-head against these guys, even though he is ranked higher than them based on average fantasy points per week? So that is 38 wins, 52 losses versus Cameron Sutton, Deontay Johnson, Isaiah Hodgins, Brandon Cooks, Darius Slayton, DJ Shark, and Nico Collins, who I believe is going to be a bit lower here at the wide receiver 52 based on average fantasy points per week compared to his wide receiver 43 status. Additionally, as far as looking forward to next season, if that wide receiver course stays the same, if we have Keenan Allen and Mike Williams there, they used their tight ends and they used Austin Eckler a lot. There's just not enough room for a guy like Joshua Palmer to be fantasy relevant, so don't fall into that if there is any kind of movement for Joshua Palmer based on his performances this season. He did well as he's a replacement player. If Mike Williams and or Keenan Allen go down, then his value goes up. But other than that, he's not somebody that you should probably really be drafting other than like at the very end of the draft if you have Keenan Allen or Mike Williams and you want to do a handcuff type situation, but I really don't think that's the right draft strategy. Now moving on to my number 4 top overrated player from 2022, Mike Williams, who is the fantasy points per week number 18 player. So this is going to be Mike Williams right here, and he is the EV 22 as you can see next to that. Now, if you were to look across Mike Williams' performances this season, you would find that he had 5 top 12 games, which is great. However, he had 0 wide receiver 1 type games. He also had 5 wide receiver 39 games or worse. 3 of them were wide receiver 72 or worse type games. Now, how does he do head-to-head versus some of the players who have lower fantasy points per game scored, however, higher EV scores? So you can see at least these two right below are going to be on this list. That is Keenan Allen and Deebo Samuel, as well as Brandon Ayuk, Terry McLaurin. So Brandon Ayuk is the ranked 22nd from fantasy points per week. Terry McLaurin's ranked 25th fantasy points per week, and Chris Olave is ranked 26th in fantasy points per week. Against that bunch, he went 24 and 24 in head-to-head matchups. He went 6-3 head-to-head against Chris Olave. Now, looking closer at that head-to-head battle, we would have found out that 3 of Mike's best weeks happened to go against 3 of Chris Olave's almost as good weeks, some of his better performances. So Chris kind of got screwed out of those performances counting towards him in this win-to-loss ratio, because you would also see that Chris Olave's absolute worst week of the season would have beaten Mike Williams in 3 different weeks this season. So a much higher floor for Chris Olave than Mike Williams. And Mike Williams, as we saw, did not have some sort of ultimately high ceiling. And I think those are the reasons for his performance. And when you factor in that Keenan Allen was missing a good portion of this season, he was able to take advantage of some of that. I think that's why he was more consistent this year, less boom or bust. But it would have been nice to see him have a little bit more of that boom, showing that he could take advantage of those situations. So that is a little bit concerning in my eyes for next season. Is he going to be totally boom or bust? Does he still have that boom as he starts to age a little bit? I don't remember his exact age, but he's starting to get there. Probably not there yet, though. Now let's move on to the number 3 overvalued player from the 2022 season, and that is going to be the average fantasy points per week player, number 13, right here, who is Mike Evans. He is the EV number 25. So big disparity here between how he looks when you look at the average fantasy points per week compared to my EV system. He had 4 top 12 games. He had 1 wide receiver 1 type game, and he had 8 wide receiver 39 or worse games. 0 of those, however, were worse than the wide receiver 57 type games. So a very high floor for Mike this season, and not a whole lot of boom, but he did have several decent weeks and 1 massive week right there in week 17. As a reminder, I only track up to week 17 because week 18 is so funky. You do miss out on some performances by doing that, but all in all, I like that because, hey, even some defensive players are sitting that might contribute towards some of those bigger performances from some guys. But all in all, how does Mike perform against the players who have lower fantasy points per week ratings and higher EV ratings? Fantasy points per week, number 13, EV number 25. Those players are going to be Devontae Adams, who is the average fantasy points per week, number 14, Tyler Lockett 15, T. Higgins 16, Godwin is 17, Mike Williams is 18, Keenan Allen's 19, Deebo Samuel's 20, Ayuk is 22, Marquise Brown is 23, DK Metcalf 24th, Terry McLaurin ranked 25th, Chris Olave once again makes this list too, ranked 26th. All those guys ended up beating Mike Evans 79 times to 68. There were also 2 ties in there. So Mike Evans lost 68 times to 79 times in head-to-head matchups against that group of guys who you would be led to believe he is better than based on the average fantasy points per week this year, which had him ranked 13th. All in all, we might not be able to use this year's performance a whole heck of a lot in order to figure out how good Mike is next season if Tom Brady leaves. So that is always going to be a huge factor. However, one would think that they're not going to have somebody who is going to make him a better receiver from this season in not being Tom Brady, but we'll see who they end up landing on for their quarterback next season. Now moving on to my number 2 overranked player, we have Justin Jefferson, who had the highest single average fantasy points per week scored and is the EV number 4, however. And here we're going to get into a factor that I actually do look at. I looked at last season in a big meta-analysis of each position in some pretty long videos and some articles that I have up on the website. I would recommend going for the articles over the videos. Tried squeezing a lot of information into those videos, and they were the first videos I made, so they're a little bit sketchy. But either way, I looked at part of that analysis of all of this information that I gathered last season was like, what's more important at positions, boom or bust? And it tends to fluctuate a little bit overall at the position. But here's going to be a case where, well, let's explain how this EV ranking, how this works. So Justin Jefferson had 75% of his games were wide receiver 24 or better games. 19% of them were wide receiver 1 or better games. 53% of those were wide receiver 6 or better games, but not wide receiver 1. And 19% of these games across the season were wide receiver 60 or worse games. So he did have a bit of a poor floor for a guy ranked so highly. We'll see that otherwise, but he did so well so many weeks too that his average fantasy points didn't suffer too much from his poorer weeks. All in all, head-to-head versus Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill, and this is going to be Jamar Chase right here, and then Tyreek Hill and Cooper Kupp are going to be 2 above him. Against those 3 players who have higher EVs than him, but lower average fantasy points per week, he went 24 and 13. And just a little bit of a closer look at those versus Jamar Chase, he went 8 and 3. Jamar Chase basically just had 0 wide receiver 45 or worse weeks, which is why he is so high up on this list because of his consistency. His lowest week would have beat JJ 3 times out of 3 of JJ's different performances. So he had a much higher floor, but he didn't quite have the same kind of ceiling. Then Tyreek Hill went 8 and 7 versus him in head-to-head games. Tyreek Hill actually had a little bit of a higher ceiling, as he had 81% of his games were wide receiver 24 or better. 6% of his games were wide receiver 60 or worse. So almost no floor there for Tyreek Hill as well. You might see a similar thing where his lowest week would have been, or maybe second lowest week would have been really good compared to Jamar Chase's. Then Cooper Kupp went 5 and 3 in head-to-head matchups. He had 89% of his games were wide receiver 24 or better. Really high there. 67% of his games were top 6 or better. He obviously was a beast yet again while he was healthy. One of those 3 losses of his against JJ was the week that he got injured. It was only 1.4 fantasy points scored, so he got injured quite earlier before he had a chance to be productive in that game. And that also tanks the above percentages due to the small sample size of his. I don't know what I said, so I wanted to very quickly clarify. Jamar Chase only won 3 times against Justin Jefferson. Justin Jefferson beat him 8 times. Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson beat Tyreek Hill 8 times, lost 7 times. And Cooper Kupp, he won 5 times, lost 3 times. So as you can see, Justin Jefferson actually performed better than these guys in head-to-head matchups. But here is where the EV system comes out and works well. Is we are talking about playing against the field, and all of these guys would have done much better against much worse wide receivers. Statistically speaking, at least they should have. The win percentages of Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, Tyreek Hill would be better against some of the guys ranked down here. And actually, I did look at JJ's win percentage versus Terry McLaurin versus this group. So where are you, Terry? So here's Terry McLaurin. He is the 25th ranked wide receiver in fantasy points per week scored. So substantially lower. He's the EV19, by the way. And so when looking versus him, Justin Jefferson's win percentage was only 60%, whereas the group's win percentage was 68% versus Terry McLaurin. If you were to only look at Tyreek Hill and Cooper Kupp there and leave Jamar Chase out, then the group, their win percentage was 75% against Terry McLaurin, whereas Justin Jefferson's was at 60%. So there's a higher chance with Justin Jefferson's very low floor weeks that he would get beat out versus some of these players versus the more consistent guys. And so although the boom of Justin Jefferson did win out against other elite receivers, when looking at versus non-elite receivers, those guys actually would have performed better in most circumstances. Now on to some honorable mentions, which are going to be other guys whose average fantasy points per week has them 4 spots higher than where the EV has them ranked. Those players are going to be Amari Cooper, Zay Jones, Tyler Boyd, Christian Kirk, Isaiah Hodgins, or not. If you look closer at Isaiah Hodgins here, there were 2 weeks where he got on the field with the Giants right after that trade, and he just didn't produce much there. Then there's a bye week, and then he comes back and all of a sudden starts to turn it on. And so I think as far as looking forward, I'll probably just get rid of those 2 weeks where they were just testing him out a little bit on the field. Then other honorable mentions here, KJ Osborne would be overrated. However, I do think that what we saw towards the end of the season showed us that there's going to be some untapped potential for him. So I'm actually looking forward to any opportunity that he may have, but he's a little bit in that. I think he's more talented than Josh Palmer, but he's a little bit in that same book of the wide receiver 3 on Minnesota shouldn't be reliable enough to be fantasy relevant next season. But if he's going to supplant Adam Thielen or something like that, or at least even split the workload, he might be somewhat fantasy relevant. And then there's also Christian Watson made this list. However, due to injuries and him being a rookie, we could overvalue him next season, but, I kind of discount that result because, well, he was great. But some people did get bitten by him. He was inconsistent even when he was great. But that's going to bring us to our number 1 overvalued receiver from the 2022 season, and that is none other than Jalen Waddle. Jalen Waddle is the 10th ranked wide receiver per average fantasy points per game scored, but he is the 13th ranked per the EV ranking. In 47% of games, Jalen Waddle had a wide receiver 24 or better result. 25% of games, he had a wide receiver 6 or better fantasy game, and in 12.5% of games, he was a wide receiver 1. So those percentages aren't terrible, they're not fantastic, but here's where he starts to, his profile starts to get hurt a little bit. In 38% of weeks, or nearly 4 out of 10 games, he was a wide receiver 39 or worse, so not even a wide receiver 3. And in 19% of games, 1 in 5 games, he was a wide receiver 63 or worse, which really puts him outside of even flex territory. Not very good stats there as far as Jalen Waddle's floor went. So I did compare him to just 2 players very specifically here in Chris Godwin, who is all the way down here, the 17th ranked via average fantasy points per game, as well as DeAndre Hopkins, who is 1 spot behind him here, ranked 11th, I believe. Yep, DeAndre and Chris Godwin there. Compared him to those 2, Jalen Waddle right here. And against Chris Godwin, he went 7 of 7 in head-to-head matchups. Chris Godwin had no wide receiver 1 games. He had about 40% of his games. He was a wide receiver 24 or better compared to the 47% for Jalen Waddle. In 31% of games, however, he had wide receiver 39 or worse games. So about 10% less, almost 7% less. When it comes to wide receiver 63 or worse games, he only had 7.5% of his games finished like that. So Chris Godwin didn't really have a great ceiling or a terrible floor this season, and that's what brought him to this 7-7 record versus Jalen Waddle, even though he was ranked much worse. However, one of the victories for Jalen Waddle was by 0.6 fantasy points, so not even a huge victory there. Then looking at DeAndre Hopkins, 1 spot behind him, Jalen Waddle went to 3 and 5 in head-to-head matchups against DeAndre. And one of the victories is a game where DeAndre Hopkins was injured and had 0.9 fantasy points. So ultimately got a bit of a cheap victory there. We could say he went 2 and 5 against DeAndre Hopkins in games where DeAndre was scored, even though DeAndre Hopkins had a lower average fantasy points per game than Jalen Waddle. Got dominated in head-to-head matchups. Games helped to be won. So Jalen Waddle ultimately was my number 1 overvalued wide receiver, and I do think that I ended up choosing him as number 1 not because he was the absolute most overvalued in terms of actual head-to-head results here. I think that was Mike Evans performed the worst with this testing. However, Jalen Waddle, I think, was a name that we tended to have some pretty rosy tinted glasses towards when looking at his performances this season. So that is it. I will have an underperforming video coming out soon enough that will be much shorter. Thank you very much for sticking around for this. Peace out.